Book 101 review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is a merger and acquisitions executive turned legal thriller author, speaker, adventurer, and of course, a debut author and the author of the novel The Burden Evidence, no other than Mr. Buddy Howard.
Thank you, Daniel.
Welcome, Mr. Buddy, and thank you so much for being part on Book 101 Review. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Sure. Well, my name, as you said, is Buddy Howard. I live in North Carolina, and for most of my life, I have worked in the financial area. Most recently as a merger and acquisition analyst or specialist, as you said. And I have always had this pipe dream of writing a novel. And I have had that since I was about 20 years old. So I'm 67 now, so I've had it for almost half of a century that I wanted to write a book, and started really writing it about 10 years ago. So it's been a long time to get here. But that's part of my background, is that it's really in finance, but always dreamt of writing a novel. And I'm hoping that some of your listeners, if they say, well, who am I to write a novel? I'm only an engineer, or I'm only a restaurant worker. I'm here to say anybody can write a novel. Everybody's got a story, and that's part of my story, is that everybody's got a story, and everybody's story counts. So if I can do it, any of your listeners can.
Yes, definitely. And Mr. Buddy Howard, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, the burden of evidence, how would you define these concept for someone hearing it for the first time? Is it purely a legal term, or does it have a broader, more cultural meaning today?
That's a great question. And the way I would respond to it is that the burden of evidence, this book is really about a situation where someone knows something, and if they let everyone else know about it, there's going to be consequences personally to him. And so he's got information, and he can't really let it be known to other people, but it's important information. And that's really the burden. It's his burden of whether to share that or not. And ultimately, it ends up being a decision he has to make, where he has to pit consequence against conscience. And this tension between conscience and consequence is something that runs throughout the book. And so that's really what it refers to. There is a fair amount of legal element to the book, because much of it takes place in the courtroom and then some within the jury room. But it is a book ultimately about the burden of knowing information that you can't share with other people.
Yes, definitely. You argue that the burden of evidence has shifted in a modern society. Where has moved from? Where has to move to?
um, I'm not sure if I totally understood your question. Sorry.
So, Mr. Body, you argue that the burden of evidence has shifted in the modern of your novel. So, what do you think, or what is the consequence where the burden and evidence move from, or where to move to?
Well, in this case, what happens is the main character finds out information that involves a court case. And in this case, he knows some of the evidence. And as he starts getting into the court proceedings, he begins to realize that there is um, large consequence of him not disclosing some of the information that he's got. And so there really is a shifting amount of evidence that implicates, in some cases, certain people that are involved in the court case that is the main case of this book. And so he ends up really having to make that decision, and it really comes at great personal cost potentially to him to disclose it. So that's what a lot of that evidence really refers to.
In a world saturated with information and misinformation, has sheer burden of evidence become too heavy for the average person to carry? Are we asking too much of a citizen to bear their own full-time researchers?
I think, again, it's a good question. I think that we all have to make these decisions. And one of the things that's been great has been of the readers who have come back to me after having read the novel, many of them said, I put myself in Paul Nelms's shoes and I tried to decide what I would do in this particular case. And they said it really helped me as I thought about some of the decisions that I'm having to make, where you have these trade-offs and you're all looking at evidence of why you should do something or why you shouldn't do something. And in many cases, they're at odds with each other, as you just mentioned. And so weighing through what the consequences of those decisions are is something that this main character does. And I think I think he's a very believable character. When I have talked to people that have read the book, they say that they like the character and like the way that he made the decisions. And it instructed them a little bit about how they should be making decisions.
Mr. Body, is there a danger that overwhelming focus on evidence can actually paralyze decision making? When does the pursuit of perfect evidence become a barrier to necessary action?
Well, that's a challenge in court because the burden in terms of guilt or not guilty is reasonable doubt. And all it takes is just a little bit of evidence to say this may not be right. The case that the prosecution is making may not be right. And so if you add enough seemingly small pieces of evidence that indicate that that may not be right, the premise that the prosecution is putting forth to the court, that's sufficient because it only takes a reasonable doubt. And that's why you have in many cases these juries that get deadlocked, and you've got some people that say, look, this rose to the level of being a reasonable doubt for me. And so that's part of the tension that exists in the novel. And to give you a little bit of a background, I didn't really give you a good introduction to what the book is really about. It's really about a guy who's 55 years old, Paul Nelms, and he's a writer, and he is married to a woman named Catherine. And Catherine comes home one night, and she has been traumatized. She was attacked, and she doesn't want to go to the police. And Paul does what I would probably want to do, and what many of my friends who are husbands say they would want to do, which is take matters in your own hands. He finds out who the attacker was. And so he does that, and it backfires. And he starts trying to extricate himself from the situation. And the longer that he goes, the worse the situation gets. And the stakes keep going up to the point he really has to decide, does he go ahead and do the right thing? But if he does the right thing, it's going to potentially cost him everything in terms of everything that he loves, and he's going to risk everything that he owns. Or does he go the other route, which is going to lead to potentially an injustice? And so that's where this consequence versus conscience comes. And that's really the tension. There's also a whodunit element to this book. And you don't really know that until the very last page. That was one of the most fun parts of writing this book, was to not really disclose who did it until the very last page. And most of the people who read this book have loved that part of it. There are a lot of twists and turns in this book, and a lot of them people never see coming, because there's just a lot of things that happen unexpectedly.
On impact and modern manifestation, how has the social media and the 24/7 news cycle transformed the burden of evidence? Does the algorithm favor the person making claim or the person tasked with disproving it?
I think that it's one of the increasing challenges when you have um, a a case like this, where there are jurors who are trying to make a decision about a person's guilt. And of course, this is fiction. You know, this is a novel, obviously. But in reality, much like in this book, the judge has to instruct the jurors. You know, you're not allowed to watch TV. You're not allowed to watch, you know, look at social media that would relate to anything having to do with this case. And as you're implying, Daniel, the challenge these days of keeping jurors sort of sanitized in terms of only being able to consider the evidence that's presented in court, and that's what they are told to do. That's the law. When you're sitting as a juror, you are only allowed to consider what is presented in the courtroom. And that again becomes part of the burden of evidence for Paul, the main character. So for example, if this isn't what happens in the book, but let's just say you knew that somebody did not do a crime, but they were accused of it, and you were on the jury, but you couldn't, for some reason, say that in court. That would put you in a very touchy situation, because you know for a fact that somebody that's innocent might be wrongfully convicted, but for some reason, if you can't disclose that, it puts you in a very difficult position.
Very well said, Mr. Buddy. Very well said. And on psychology and personal responsibility, what is the psychological toll to individuals or on individuals who constantly feel they must shoulder this burden to prove their facts, their worth, or even their live experiences?
I think there's a huge psychological burden. In the novel, what I did is I ended up with the main character seeing a psychiatrist. And in my mind, the main character is probably pretty close to me. As I wrote this story, I thought many times, this guy's doing exactly what I think I'd probably be doing. And he has some help, some professional help to get through making these decisions. And some of the most meaningful exchanges that occur in this book occur between this guy's psychiatrist and him. I've got a couple of exchanges that I just love. The main character Paul is grieving at one point in the one of the sessions with his psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist was talking to him, and Paul, the main character, says, "You know, I hate this part where you have to grieve over someone's loss." And the psychiatrist says, "Paul, you know, you don't. Let me tell you a story. You don't really understand what you're saying, because I went on a mission trip to Uganda, and I met a woman who her daughter was attacked and killed, and the husband tried to defend her and was put in a hospital. He was beat so severely, and she had to work 3 different jobs to make enough money to keep the husband alive with the medicine. And that woman told this person that she didn't have time to grieve, that grieving was a privilege. And so the psychiatrist is telling Paul, the main character, this story, and he says, Paul, this woman will not recover nearly as quickly as you will because you have the privilege of grieving, and she does not. And so there are things like that that I've been able to work into this book that I totally believe. I believe what I just said. I believe that. And I'm not saying that I would enjoy going through grieving, but I understand that there are people who are so stretched out in terms of life that they don't even have the ability to grieve. And so I understand that. And there's wisdom in this book like that. And it goes back to that psychological element that you just brought up.
Mr. Buddy, tell us on a personal level, in our daily conversations and disagreements, how can we consciously ensure we are not unfairly placing the burden of evidence on others? How can we argue in good faith?
I think that it's similar to the situation where someone said, until you've walked in someone else's shoes, you don't really know exactly where they're coming from. And I think it's a little bit that way with evidence. So, for example, you may see something, I may see something, and you and I may see the same thing, but you see it differently than I do. It's almost like those little drawings that you would get as a kid, and you'd say, is this a unattractive woman or is this a beautiful woman? And you'd look at it one way and you'd see it one way, and you'd look at it the other way and you go, oh no, this is a horrible hag or whatever. And you're looking at the same thing, but your interpretation of it is different. So I think that everybody has to go into it with the idea that everybody's bringing something different to the table. And as you're looking at evidence, whatever that evidence is, you have to be understanding to see that there's different perspectives, and yours isn't always right. It may be right from the vantage point that you have, but theirs may be right also and might be right at the same time that yours is.
Mr. Buddy, as a debut author, merger and acquisition executive turned legal thriller author, what are your short term and long term goals?
I would love to have the book be successful, and I don't have a specific set of numbers that would constitute success. The greatest success for me is when someone reads it and then says they enjoyed it, talks about the characters, talks about the plot. The plot moves very fast. And so when I have someone that says that they enjoyed it or engages with me about that, that really to me constitutes success. And I think long term, I would like to have another book. I've had several people say, this really needs to have a sequel. So I think at some point I'd love to have a sequel.
Good luck to your goals, Mr. Buddy, and looking forward for more success. And can you give a piece of advice for those people out there want to be like you?
I'd love to. The first thing that I would say is if anybody is thinking that they would like to write a book and they don't think they can, let me just say they can. And the other thing that I would say, a couple of other things I would say are, it doesn't have to be a book. Even if you just write a story, even if you write your memoir, there is a journey that it takes you as the writer where you learn just by writing it down. I did do one thing that I just think has been great, and that was to start probably 25 years ago, a little place on my computer, a file called Writing Thoughts. And I would go through, something would happen sometime that day. I'd hear a phrase or I'd hear something and I'd go, I love that. And so I would write it down in that file. And so I started collecting it. It's probably, I don't know, several hundred pages long now of just random collections of something someone said to me or a phrase that I thought was a well-turned phrase or something else. And I'll give you one example. I heard one time I was in the car listening to the radio, and there was a gang member that was being interviewed, and the interviewer said, "Did you ever think about just getting a job?" And the guy said, "No, that'd be slow money." And he said, "I was always interested in fast money." And I started thinking about that concept of slow money and fast money and how that would affect a young person's perspective about things. And so I ended up saying, I'd like to write a novel or a story about this character. And so I started writing a story about this gang member. His name is Levi. And then I ended up putting him in the burden of evidence. So I started writing the burden of evidence, and I thought, you know what, I could put Levi in here. And so I grabbed the section of the novel, different novel, and put it into the burden of evidence. And so now Levi's in that character. But that was an example of me listening to the radio, hearing that concept of slow money and fast money, and thinking, I'm going to write that down and collect that in this writing thoughts file that I've got. And when I started writing the novel, I pulled from that file. I mean, a lot of things that I pulled came from that particular file that I had.
Interesting, Mr. Buddy, and thank you for that advice. So, can you please recommend a book or books by influencer Johnny?
So, sorry, you cut out. There was a little bit of a static. Say that again.
Can you please recommend a book or books that influencer Johnny?
I think Stephen King, who had a book called On Writing, is one of them. And he had a quote in there that I just loved, and I followed it in this book. He said, I like to put my characters in impossible situations and then just see what they will do. And that's kind of what happened with this book. I started out with an idea where the plot was going to go in this book, and then started writing it. And then all of a sudden, it was almost as if after a while the characters started writing the book themselves, because I'd be writing it and all of a sudden I'd go, oh my gosh, I think Paul just did this, or he wants to do this. And so I would write that into it. And it really created these just impossibly difficult situations. And it made for good tension in a book. When you want that in a book, you want a lot of tension. And one other book that I read was an editor wrote a book called The Forest for the Trees. And she said in there, when you're writing, every word should be on trial for its life. And what she meant by that was that you really have to be respectful of the reader in terms of the number of words that you're using. So I went through, this book has probably been through about 4 editors, and each one took a slice of words that just didn't need to be in there and cut it out. So the pacing is really good in this book. And part of the reason for that is it was so heavily edited. And so, you have a lot of action. By page 3, there's a major development that is kind of gut-wrenching. I mean, you're sitting there kind of at the edge of your seat by page 3. So that was good advice, I think, that I got from Edith Hamilton, who wrote The Forest for the Trees, to be concise.
And Mr. Buddy, before we wrap up our discussion for today, and thank you for that recommendation. And before we wrap up our discussion, please do listen to my other podcast, people, because my Abstract Essay is already in 5th season, Abstract Poetry in 2nd season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too. Comedy 101 and second season. I'm a Food 101 in fifth season as well. Geography 101 and fourth season. I'm a Baby Podcast Law 101 and Mental Health 101. Love Letters in third season. And Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in fourth season. And Science 101 and Sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. Body, for our listeners or viewers who feel overwhelmed by the constant need to fact check and defend their reality, what is your message of hope?
I think that they can rest assured that they will, if they continue to look for the truth, they will find it. And I think in many cases that's what happens in this case. One of the themes in this novel is that truth ultimately comes out, and I do believe that there's an intrinsic energy in truth. Things that are wrong, things that are false, lies, they don't have any intrinsic energy to get out. Truth does. Truth, by virtue of the fact that it's there, that it exists, that it's real, that's evidence of existence. And it's trying to get out all the time. So I think that I hope that people that are struggling with that question will buy the book, and I think they will see get some ideas when they're thinking about that and wrestling with that question.
Mr. Body, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, hoping for more and more empowering books like this to come. So,
Thank you,
can you
Daniel.
please invite our listeners to support your debut book, The Burden Evidence?
Yes, that you can reach me at buddyhoward.com, and the book is available on basically anywhere books are sold, and on Amazon as well.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Buddy Howard because if you support him, for sure, more and more empowering books like this to come. So, Mr. Buddy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.